Mid-April 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing, yet on a battered airfield outside Munich, an elite squadron of German fighter pilots was gathering. They called themselves Jagdverband 44, the squadron of experts. Among the tired men eating sandwiches by the alert shack stood Franz Stigler, a veteran pilot. He barely noticed the stranger who walked into their midst, a major with the Knight's Cross at his throat. Then one of the pilots did a double take. "Barkhorn?" he asked. The stranger chuckled and nodded. It was Gerd Barkhorn, the second greatest ace in history, with 301 victories. He had come from Florida to join the unit. Franz Stigler embraced his former flight cadet, and the two men laughed together. That night at the formal dinner in the orphanage mess hall, General Adolf Galland kept a seat empty beside him. The double doors creaked open. Colonel Gunther Luitzow, the man of ice, strode in from his Italian exile. Galland beamed. The morale of the pilots soared as Luitzow took his place at the table. During the meal, Luitzow nodded to Franz Stigler, remembering him from Sicily. The next evening, Franz Stigler borrowed an accordion from his host family. In the barroom, the pilots drank cognac and asked him to play songs over and again. They sang Lily Marlene and Gershwin tunes. The music stopped when Colonel Hannes Trautloft entered with Steinhoff and Luitzow. Trautloft, a decorated fighter pilot himself, sat down and told the men what he had seen at the Buchenwald labor camp, the imprisoned Allied airmen, the crematorium, the SS guards. Franz Stigler listened, shaken. He had always known the party could imprison a man for a joke, but Trautloft's account made him realize the camps had become something far worse. The question hung in the air: what kind of country had they been fighting for? 4 days later, on the afternoon of April 18, the field was alive with activity. Johannes Steinhoff, the operations officer, climbed into his May 262 and started the engines. Walter Krupinski, the count, pulled up behind his left wing. Steinhoff's jet lurched down the cratered runway, gaining speed. 3/4 of the way along the strip, his left tire exploded. The jet veered violently left. The landing gear collapsed. The left engine slapped the earth. The plane bounced, then fell heavily downward. The count's jet skimmed just past Steinhoff's tail. Steinhoff's plane slammed to the ground, stripped of both engines, and burst into flames. Franz Stigler sprinted from the alert shack. He saw Johannes Steinhoff staggering from the blaze, a human torch. 2 mechanics reached Steinhoff first and pulled him from the fire, their hands burning on his liquefied jacket. Franz helped lift Steinhoff into the bed of a Kettenkrad, a small half-track vehicle used to tow planes. They poured bucket after bucket of cold water on him. When they tried to remove his flight helmet, they found his scalp had fused to it. His fingers had melted into claws. His skin clung to his uniform. Franz thought it would be more merciful to shoot his friend. He looked for his pistol, but it hung inside the shack. Then Gunther Luitzow knelt beside Steinhoff. As the water was poured, he leaned close to where the ear had been and whispered something. Steinhoff grew still. Luitzow turned away, and Franz saw the most stoic man he had ever known begin to cry without sound, just tears. Franz began to cry as well. An ambulance took Steinhoff to Oberforing Military Hospital. His eyelids were gone. He could not blink, but he was alive. The Count rushed to the hospital, determined to kill Steinhoff if he suffered, but the doctors would not let him near, and he relented. Steinhoff would survive, though horribly disfigured. 4 days later, on April 22, General Adolf Galland walked alone up the snowy mountainside of the Obersalzberg. He had been summoned by Hermann Göring. Galland expected to be killed inside the chalet. Göring supervised the removal of his art collection. But the Reichsmarschall was not sinister. He seemed deeply depressed. He received Galland with civility. He admitted his mistake about the Me 262. Galland had been right to want it for the fighter pilots, not the bombers. Then Göring said, "I envy you, Galland, for going into action. I wish I were a few years younger and less bulky." Galland departed with a smirk on his face. He could not wait to tell Gunther Luitzow that even though the war was lost, they had won a battle. Göring, the man who had hounded them, had conceded. For a moment, the mutineers had triumphed. But the war was not yet finished. There was still work to do. 2 days later, on April 24, Gunther Luitzow led a flight of 5 Me-262s against American bombers and their escorts. Franz Stigler followed in his jet, 20,000 feet over the German countryside. Franz saw his right engine gauges surge. He called WWII. "Sir, I think I'm losing an engine." WWII told him to return to base. Franz reluctantly peeled off and headed for Munich. WWII continued toward the bombers with the remaining 4 jets. On the radio, Franz heard the flight call, contact with enemy bombers and then enemy fighters. P-47s were diving on them. WWII ordered the formation to split. Franz leaned forward, checking his own tail even though he was far from the fight. He heard someone say they were taking hits. Then WWII's voice cut across the radio. He was hit. Someone shouted for evasive maneuvers. Silence. Then Walter Krupinski's voice crackled. "Sir? Want to form up?" No reply. The other pilots called WWII again and again. They could see his jet flying straight and level, but he did not answer. His plane banked gracefully to the south toward the snow-capped Alps. It flew on, shrinking until it was barely visible. Then, 12 miles away, an orange flash appeared just above the trees. The pilots watched WWII vanish from the earth. Radar operators reported that his blip was gone. Later, the P-47 pilots would report that he had nosed forward and dived straight down into a forest near Donauwörth. No survivor, no body recovered. That night at the orphanage dinner table, Franz Stigler could not bring himself to look across the room. Galland sat alone. To his right was the empty chair of Johannes Steinhoff, who lay in a hospital bed. To his left was another empty seat, where the man of ice had once sat. The next morning, the airfield was quiet. General Galland gathered the pilots in a loose formation near the alert shack. He told them the war was over for their unit. Anyone who wanted to go home could leave. A few men thanked him and walked away, citing families or sick parents, but someone else said they would fight until the end. Galland's eyes twinkled. He said he was proud to belong to the last fighter pilots of the German Air Force. Franz Stigler chose to stay. Far to the west, Gerd Barkhorn was in trouble. His Me-262's right engine was smoking over a forest. A pack of P-51s had chased him low. He knew he could not fight or bail out. He steered for a clearing to crash land. The jet touched down, skipped, and slid. As it slowed, Barkhorn stood to leap, but the nose pitched violently. The canopy slammed down onto his neck, pinning him. He watched the left engine sizzle. The P-51 circled but did not strafe. People from a nearby village found him alive and took him to a hospital. He would survive at the airfield. Franz heard the news of Barkhorn's survival. He felt a small relief. The next day, a flight of P-47 Thunderbolts ripped overhead. Rockets slung under their wings. Franz dove for cover. The fighters strafed the field, kicking up dirt. In the middle of it all, Galland landed his own 262 with a flat tire and a bloody knee. Franz helped him hobble to cover. Later, Franz joked that he would never lend Galland a plane again. Galland just smiled sheepishly. The next day, a young lieutenant named Willy Pirschan appeared at the hangar. He was an Austrian who had just come from jet school but brought no plane of his own. He begged Franz to let him fly just once so he could say he flew combat with JV-44 before the war ended. Franz refused at first. He told Pirschan there was no time for glory flying, but the boy kept pleading. Finally, Franz relented. Franz led Pirschan to White 3, the repaired jet. Franz had flown for weeks. He gave the young pilot one condition: take off, circle a few times, and land. Pirschan nodded eagerly and strapped in. Franz watched him start the engines and taxi. The jet lifted off, banked left, and began to orbit the field. Then the engines cut to silence. Franz saw the jet dip behind the rooftops. A metallic crack echoed. Black smoke billowed. Franz raced to the village of Oberweissenfeld in a truck. Pirschan had crashed between two houses. The locals had pulled him out and laid him on a mattress. His head had slammed into the gun sight, and his brain was exposed. Franz held him as he thrashed in pain. Pirschan asked Franz to tell his mother and sister goodbye. Franz promised he would. He gave the young fighter a shot of pain reliever. The boy died in his arms. That evening, Franz found Galland in his lodge, his leg in a plaster cast. The general told Franz he had just missed the SS who had come to arrest him. Galland explained his plan. He intended to deliver JV-44 to the Americans before the war ended. He was certain the Americans would soon fight the Soviets and would want the jets. Franz listened without enthusiasm. He had never wanted to fight for Germany, let alone another nation. Galland asked Franz to fly one more mission for him as a comrade. He needed time to contact the Americans, but feared the jets would be destroyed on the ground. He wanted Franz to ferry every flyable plane to Salzburg, Austria, the next morning, where they would be safer. Franz knew the SS would execute every man in the unit if they caught wind of such a plan. He agreed to go as far as Salzburg. Galland smiled and told Franz he had put him in for the Knight's Cross weeks ago. Early the next morning, Franz landed at Salzburg Airport. He shouldered a backpack filled with canned food and decided to escape into the mountains. He planned to head south, cut west, and surrender to the Americans rather than the Soviets. With Galland laid up, he saw no further need to fight. He found a Kettenkrad in a hangar, fully fueled. He started the vehicle and drove away, alone, for 6 days. Franz drove west through the Alpine passes. The road wound alongside icy streams and through pine forests. He siphoned gas from abandoned cars. He stopped at a lodge where other soldiers had gathered, waiting. On May 1st, he heard over the radio that Hitler was dead. Germany's forces began surrendering. On May 4th, Franz decided it was safe. He left the lodge and drove his Kettenkrad toward Berchtesgaden. The Kettenkrad sputtered and halted, out of fuel. Franz grabbed his backpack and stepped out. He tossed his pistol into the empty vehicle and began walking west in his heavy boots. He passed through a hamlet and stopped. Hanging from a telephone pole was a dead German soldier in a gray uniform. Franz kept walking around a bend. He came upon a group of SS soldiers setting up an ambush. They glared at him, but he walked through them as if invisible. They let him live. Several miles later, the logging road merged with a main road. Franz saw an American armored vehicle, a white star on its hood. He raised his arms in surrender. The infantrymen were rough at first, assuming he was an SS man in disguise. But when they saw his logbook, they realized the truth. The Army Air Force's interrogators recognized him immediately. Franz had survived the war. He was now a prisoner of the Americans. Spring 1946. Franz Stigler was back in Germany, a free man. He found work at a brickyard in the town of Straubing. The manager took one look at him and refused to hire him because of what he was, a former Luftwaffe fighter pilot. Stigler, exhausted and still haunted, lost his temper. He punched the man. German police arrived and dragged Stigler into a dark alley. He braced for a beating, but the officer in charge stopped and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a pack of American cigarettes and offered Stigler one. 3 officers were all former servicemen themselves, a flak gunner, an airfield guard, and an infantryman. They recognized a brother in arms. They smoked together in the alley, then snapped to attention and saluted him. Stigler, still in his tattered flight boots, returned the salute. They let him walk away. Stigler scraped by, delivering what he earned to his mother and his wife Eva, whom he had married in 1948. In 1947, he found steady work at the old Messerschmitt plant in Augsburg, now building sewing machines instead of fighters. There he repaired the very contraptions that had once been riveted by women in factories he had tried to protect. In the spring of 1953, an old comrade reached out. Gustav Rodel, a fellow ace, met Stigler at a pub southwest of Munich. Rodel told him the Allies were planning to rebuild the German Air Force and that men like Steinhoff and Trautloff were already being considered for command. He urged Stigler to stay and fly again. Stigler shook his head. He had already accepted a job in Canada to work on a new fighter jet, the Avro Arrow. He had also kept a promise. After his release, he traveled to Graz, Austria, to find the mother and sister of Lieutenant Willy Pierre-Chan, the young pilot who had died in his arms. He delivered their boys final goodbyes. He never spoke of that visit again. Stigler and Eva moved to Vancouver, Canada in mid-1953. The Avro Arrow was classified as top secret. He applied for a security clearance, but was refused because he had once been a German officer. The job vanished before it began. He found work instead as a diesel mechanic at a logging camp on the remote Queen Charlotte Islands. He learned English, worked with his hands, and lived among lumberjacks. His marriage to Eva did not survive the transition. They divorced amicably in 1954. Alone on the island, he wrote letters home. One of them reached the Grice family in Berlin. A reply came from a young woman named Haya. The daughter of the pension clerk Stigler had met 14 years earlier. She was 23, curious, and wanted to know about Canada. They corresponded for 2 years. In 1956, she boarded a plane and flew to Vancouver. Stigler was waiting at the airport. Within the year, they were married by 1980. Franz Stigler had built a quiet life in Vancouver, Canada with his wife Haya. He rarely spoke of the war, but the memory of that crippled B-17 haunted him. He still wondered if the bomber had made it home, if his mercy had been worth the risk. Then one day an old comrade appeared at his doorstep. Adolf Galland, the former general, had come from Germany for a hunting trip. The two men spent days in the Canadian wilderness, and Stigler finally told Galland the story of the bomber he had let escape. Galland listened without judgment, but he filed the story away. 5 years later, in 1985, Stigler attended the 50th anniversary of the Boeing B-17 in Seattle. 5,000 veterans crowded the tarmac. Stigler wandered among them, a lone German, asking if anyone knew of a bomber that had been spared by a German fighter. He described the damage, the missing tail, the shattered turret. No one had heard of such a thing. He left without an answer, convinced he would never know the fate of that crew but across the continent. In Florida, a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel named Charles L. Brown was having the same dreams. Brown had never forgotten the German pilot who had saluted him and flown away. At a reunion of his pilot class, a fellow officer, Medal of Honor recipient Joe Jackson, urged Brown to search for the man who spared him. Brown wrote to Jägerblatt, the German fighter pilot's newsletter. The editor refused to publish the letter, so Brown wrote to Galland asking for help. Galland remembered Stigler's story, and he ordered the editor to print the letter. In January 1990, Brown's letter appeared, asking the German pilot to come forward. When Stigler's copy of Jägerblatt arrived at his home in Vancouver, he read the letter and froze. He called out to Haya. This was the bomber, the one he had spared. He sat at his typewriter and pounded out a letter to Brown, telling him he was happy the crew had made it. He sealed the envelope and mailed it to the address in the newsletter. 5 days later in Miami, Brown opened the letter. He read it once, then again. The details matched, but he needed to be sure. He picked up the phone and called directory assistants in Vancouver. When Brown heard Stigler's voice on the line, he asked a series of questions. Stigler described the bomber's damage, the missing left stabilizer, the shredded rudder, the shattered tail gun position. Brown had never published those details. Then Stigler said something Brown had kept secret even from his own letter. He said, "When I let you go over the sea, I thought you would never make it across." Brown began to cry. He knew he had found the right man. "My God, it is you," he said. They talked for an hour. Brown asked what Stigler had been pointing at during those desperate minutes over the coast. Stigler told him, "I was trying to get you to land in Sweden." Brown laughed and said he would still be speaking Swedish if he had understood. He thanked Stigler again and again. They agreed to meet in person as soon as possible, but Stigler's health delayed the trip. Finally, on June 21, 1990, Brown traveled to Seattle, and the two former enemies embraced in the lobby of an Embassy Suites hotel. Stigler had brought Hia with him. Brown had brought Joe Jackson, the man who had encouraged his search. The four of them sat in Brown's hotel room, and Jackson filmed their conversation. Stigler told Brown the truth he had carried for 47 years. "I was not out of ammunition," he said. "My guns were full." Brown was stunned. He had always assumed the German had simply run out of bullets. Stigler told him, "The real reason I could not shoot you," he said. "You were too badly damaged. It would have been murder." Brown asked why Stigler had risked a court-martial to spare them. Stigler told him about his brother August, a night fighter pilot killed in 1940. He had never gotten over the loss. When he saw the broken B-17 with its dead tail gunner, he thought of his brother. He could not be the one to bring that grief to another family. Brown listened in silence. Then Stigler told him something he would never forget. "In 1940, I lost my only brother," he said. "On December 20th, 1943, I had the chance to save a B-17. The pilot, Charlie Brown, is for me as precious as my brother was." 3 months later, in September 1990, the 379th Bomb Group held a reunion in Massachusetts. Brown invited Stigler as his guest. A B-17 sat parked on the tarmac, and Stigler walked around it with his cane, comparing it to the broken machine he had seen so long ago. Brown led him under the wing where two old men were waiting. Sam Blackford, the ball turret gunner, was already crying. Dick Petchout, the radio operator, took off his glasses and wiped his eyes. They thanked Stigler for sparing their lives, for letting them raise their children and see their grandchildren. Stigler broke down. He had never imagined this moment. He had expected anger, not gratitude. But the men of the 379th surrounded him, hugging him, thanking him. Brown watched and smiled. Later, Stigler gave Brown a book about the squadron of experts. Inside the cover, he had written an inscription. It said, "The pilot, Charlie Brown, is for me as precious as my brother was." "Thanks, Charlie." Your brother Franz Brown read it and could hear Stigler's voice. Franz Stigler had never received the Knight's Cross, the medal Galland had promised him. As he stood among the families of the men he had spared, he realized he had received something better. He had received the gratitude of living men, the knowledge that his mercy had borne fruit across generations. 25 people owed their existence to that decision over the North Sea. Blackford's children, Pachut's grandchildren, Brown's own daughters. They were all there because one man had chosen not to shoot. In February 2008, the United States Air Force completed a lengthy investigation into the events of December 20, 1943. They ruled that the military had made a mistake 64 years earlier. In April 2008, they summoned Brown to the Florida State Capitol and awarded him the Air Force Cross, the nation's second highest medal for valor. The last living crewman, Doc Sadok, received the Silver Star. 8 posthumous Silver Stars were awarded to the deceased crew. The crew of Ye Olde Pub became one of the most decorated bomber crews in history. In the years that followed, the men of JV-44 rebuilt their lives. Johannes Steinhoff survived his horrific burns and rose to command the entire German Air Force. Gerd Barkhorn, Hannes Trautloft, and Walter Krupinski all served with distinction in the new Luftwaffe, retiring as generals. Adolf Galland survived the war, was taken prisoner by the Americans, and later visited Stigler in Canada. The brotherhood of the squadron of experts had endured. Stigler did not live to see that day. He died in March 2008 in Haya's arms after 52 years of marriage. He had asked her to cremate his body and keep his ashes close. "I promise I will not be a bother," he said. Brown died 8 months later in November 2008. They had spent their final years traveling across America, telling their story to anyone who would listen. Their message was simple. Former enemies are better off as friends. An act of mercy once given can never be taken back.